the associate pastor nominating committee, and one of the things that has been so fun for me, at least in introducing our church to so many incredible candidates for the position, has been talking about how educated our church is and how interested our church members are in theological education. So I'm just thrilled that so many of you are here this morning and interested in learning about the Exodus. I think I'll take a few minutes here at the outset and just talk about the Exodus. What is it? And because it's much more than just a memory of a past story in the Bible. And then we'll dive into the details of the text. So today is the sort of start of the story, and then next week we'll be focusing in on the plague narratives in 7 to 12, and we'll go on with Cameron, and we'll go on from there. So thank you all so much for being here. Okay, what is the Exodus? It is a paradigmatic story. It's defining for ancient Israel's history, for ancient Israel's God. It is the most, and that means our God, it is the most important event in the Bible. I think Dr. Brent Strawn said this when he was on during our last Sunday Morning Scholars event, and hopefully you'll get a sense for why he said that after I make a few introductory remarks. And that, I mean by the Bible, certainly the Old Testament, but also the New Testament as well. So if you think about introducing yourself to others, about telling others about your story, the story of your life, there's probably some event in your life or your family that is absolutely definitive. Like, you can't imagine telling someone your story without including a reference to that event. It's something on which your identity hangs, and without which you wouldn't be the person or the family that you are. And Exodus is that kind of a story in the Bible. It is the sort of paradigm defining ancient Israel's identity and history. And this is actually reflected a bit in our culture, which has really little interest in most biblical stories. But even here, the Exodus gets more attention. There have been major motion picture films produced about the Exodus, even quite recently, and every year around Passover and Easter. As you know, the Ten Commandments airs on national TV. But as Dale Hamrick told me recently, the book is better than the movie. So I'm glad you're all getting into the book. So you can see how Exodus becomes this paradigm through which Israel understands its unfolding story by looking at other texts. For example, Isaiah draws on Exodus imagery to say that the return of the people from the exile is not just a return of the people from exile, it's a new Exodus out of a foreign land that will lead them into the promised land once again. And various Psalms, like Psalm 73, pick up on the language of the Exodus and understand God primarily as the God of the Exodus. And there are many texts, more texts that I could cite, where you see prophets and others drawing on the Exodus as the defining event for ancient Israel's identity and their God. And the Jews who followed Jesus understood him as a new Moses. So here's where you see the Exodus being so important in the New Testament. When they sought to grasp and describe the liberation that they understood God to be accomplishing through Jesus for them, they turned to the Exodus for the language and the form of the story to draw on to tell the story about Jesus. So Matthew, for example, presents Jesus as a new Moses. Jesus in Matthew is born. He has to flee because the male babies of his people are being slaughtered, just like in the Exodus. He finds refuge in Egypt, just like Moses. And on his way out of Egypt, he passes through the waters when John baptizes him. And then he climbs up the mount to give God's new law to God's people in Matthew 5 to 7, Sermon on the Mount. And then in the Gospels, they differ on this point, but Jesus dies either right before the Passover or on Passover, the Jewish celebration of the time when God passed over their homes and spared them from the fate of the final plague. In John, Jesus is actually crucified at the exact moment when the Passover sacrifice was made in the temple, which funds Christian understandings of Jesus as the Lamb of God, and so on. So, and this has continued into our own history in terms of the Exodus being a defining event for God's people. It continues to be important to so many struggles for liberation throughout our own country and around the world. The struggle for the abolition of slavery, slavery and then the civil rights movement both drew heavily on the Exodus narrative about Israel's liberation from bondage. And liberation theology, which emerged in the 70s in Latin America and has continued, it also relies on the Exodus narrative as the paradigmatic story of salvation. I actually learned not too long ago that Harriet Tubman was known as Moses as she conducted slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad. And Martin Luther King explicitly presented himself as our new Moses, as he often talked about the civil rights movement being a movement out of bondage in Egypt through the trying journey in the wilderness that he was living and into a new future that he could foresee when we could reach the promised land of racial equality and justice. In fact, in his famous final speech, the famous mountaintop speech, it ends with him ominously speaking about his death. The night before he was assassinated, he was in Memphis, where he'd gone to support striking sanitation workers. And he said, God has, quote, allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So he is Moses. Martin is Moses. He led the people like Moses to the brink of the promised land. And like Moses, he could not go in, but he foresaw the entry into that promised land. And then the Exodus is reenacted in ancient Israel's ongoing ritual life, and later in Judaism, and even for us in Christianity. Passover, as you all know, is celebrated around the same time as Easter every spring. And it requires the people to get up on their feet and relive the Exodus and retell the story and eat the bread of affliction. In Deuteronomy, Moses speaks to the Israelites who had been born in the wilderness after the Exodus. And they were not, in fact, the folks who had been enslaved and freed through the Exodus event, but he addresses them as those who have come out of the land of Egypt. So you can see this if you want to look it up later in Deuteronomy 5, 3-4. He says, it's not our fathers, it's not our ancestors who experienced the Exodus, but us, all of us who are here today. And this is not true. Like there's, people talk about reading the Bible literally. You can't read this literally because these people that Moses is addressing in Deuteronomy are not actually the people who came out of Egypt, but they're being addressed that way. So it is, it's not false. It's the way that Israel talks about the Exodus. Every new generation has to take up the story as the story of their own lives. And it's our story too. We are all always participating in this ongoing journey out of bondage through liberation and into new life. And you can see this just most clearly, I think, in our sacraments. In baptism, we pass through the waters, we die to our lives, enslaved as they were to sin, and emerge into a new life free to serve God with our whole lives. And then we gather around the table at communion to celebrate the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, our communion. Again, the Last Supper was likely the Passover meal in Matthew and Luke, and in John, Jesus is the Lamb of God who gives his body and blood to save his people, just like the lamb at Passover. So we are then called to leave the meal at communion and participate in the ongoing journey out of Egypt and slavery and into glad obedience to God with lives of service on behalf of our neighbors and our world. So that's all just by way of introduction, hopefully for all 4 weeks that you can understand hopefully better now what all this means. What it means is that the Exodus is not an event in the past in the Bible. It's an ever-present process, a journey that is ongoing. It's the story of our life of faith as a liberation journey with God. And it's the story we're supposed to learn and teach our children. So I think that there's never a story that's more relevant and important. And in this moment, I think in particular resonates with our lives, as hopefully you've gotten from the sermon series Kathy's been and Stephanie have been preaching, and which continues in this month. Much more could be said, but I want to get into the details of the text because that's where I think the true payoff comes in my experience. And that's what we must know if we're going to live our lives on this journey of liberation with God. So Exodus 1 begins. Hopefully you got your Bibles. You did your homework. Ends with a very thin little thread connecting Exodus to the stories of the ancestors in Genesis. We get a reference to the children of Jacob, or Israel as he's now known, and a reference to Joseph. And then in verse 6 of chapter 1, there's this sweeping sort of clearing of the decks. Well, this connects to Jacob and Joseph and all the rest, but then they all died and all that is gone. So forget about all of that. But we're told in verse 7 that now, hopefully when I read this verse, you'll be thinking another verse will come to your mind. The Israelites were fruitful and prolific, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Fruitful and multiply and fill the land. Hopefully you're thinking of creation, where people are created and they're told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So this is a reference to those the God's purposes in creation for humans to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and also a reference to God's promises to the ancestors that Abraham would have offspring that would be as numerous as the sand of the sea and the stars of the sky, and yada yada. So what we're seeing here is that God's promises for human beings and for the Israelites in particular are being fulfilled, but there's a problem for us here as readers of Genesis and Exodus. The problem is that the good news is coming to pass in the wrong place. We are in Egypt, we're outside the land, and problems arise for the Israelites right away as well, not just for us readers. In verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So a new Pharaoh rises to power, a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph, we're told. Of course, up here in the mountains, we say Yosef, not Joseph. New Pharaoh rises who doesn't know Yosef. And that is important. Now they are just the Israelites. They are unmoored from any identity. They're nameless. And Pharaoh is seeing the blessing of God come to fruition among the Israelites, and Pharaoh feels threatened. The possibility of their escape from Egypt is here for the first time mentioned in the text. And now in the next section, we get plan A from Pharaoh about what to do with this threat that he perceives in his midst. Note the words that are used to describe the Israelites' condition. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. So did you note the words, right? Taskmasters, oppress, forced labor, ruthless, bitter, hard. I mean, the text is trying very hard to emphasize that what we have here is intense physical oppression. This story is primarily the story of liberating, first and foremost, the bodies of people from physical oppression. And note also what they're tasked with doing. They're tasked with building storage centers for Pharaoh's stuff. They're not building spaces for life, but instead walls behind which goods can be hoarded, most likely for military purposes. So Pharaoh sees the Israelites multiplying not as God's blessing, but as a threat to his social order. And indeed, Pharaoh inhabits a world in which he sits securely at the top, and the Israelites secure his seat at the top through their backbreaking work at the very bottom of society. So Pharaoh undoubtedly has actuaries and accountants and all kinds of insurance folks there to calculate and add things up. And he knows that if you increase the harshness of forced labor, that fertility rates should decline in proportion with the increase. So he tries that, but it turns out that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more the Egyptians loathed them. So Pharaoh's plan is called shrewd in verse 10, if you noticed, but it's not working. So we get plan B in verses 15 through 17. Then the king of Egypt, he's just the king of Egypt now. It's not just the Israelites that are nameless, but you never learn what Pharaoh's name is in this whole story. So the context of oppression is dehumanizing for both the oppressed Israelites and the oppressor Pharaoh. And he's not even Pharaoh here, he's just the king of Egypt, said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. We for the first time get names. These midwives, these servants of the lowest in ancient Egyptian society are given names. When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. Okay, the patriarchal world in which Pharaoh lives and thinks is a world where he thinks if you kill the boys, the girls will marry others, and these Hebrews will no longer be a people. They will no longer be a threat. The irony, of course, is that the resistance begins not with the men, who Pharaoh sees as the primary threat, but with the women. Pharaoh thought the men were the primary threat to his regime, whereas the reservoir of resistance actually lay within the women. It is the women who begin Pharaoh's downfall, and we'll see this continue in chapter 2. So Pharaoh summons the midwives to interrogate them about their criminal behavior when they do not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. And they behave in a way that anthropologists observe to be typical among oppressed people. When the normative expectations are harmful to your people, and when it's too risky to violate these norms, much less name the injustices that they encode, one strategy can be to play dumb. Again, that anthropologists have noticed in many cultures. Oh, shucks, I just can't get there in time, Mr. Pharaoh. I'm sorry. That's what the women do. They're just so vigorous. And what does Pharaoh hear? Undoubtedly, he hears them say, I would kill them, sir, but I guess I'm just a dumb old slow country girl. So he probably dismisses them as dumb old slow country girls and incompetent, idiots. And meanwhile, they're winking at each other on their way out of Pharaoh's court, which is exactly where they want to be heading, safely out of Pharaoh's domain. So Pharaoh then tries plan C, throw the baby boys in the Nile. This leads to the introduction of our next set of women in chapter 2. Again, the role of women in this Exodus story has really been underappreciated by so many images of just Moses leading the people. It doesn't start with Moses. It starts with Shiphrah and Puah, and then in chapter 2 with Moses' mother, who's known traditionally as Yocheved, and sister Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter, who, by the way, the rabbis named Batya, which is daughter Bat of Yahweh, of the Lord. So together, these women will work against Pharaoh's so-called shrewd plan by saving the child who will be at the center of Egypt's downfall. So Moses' mother conceives a child in these terrible times. Just imagine getting pregnant in the midst of a decree like this, throw the baby boys into the Nile. It's an incredibly fraught moment in the narrative that the story just passes over rather quickly. Moses is born into a Levite family, and as you might know, the Levites is just one of these priestly families in Israel, but little of that is given attention in the narrative. His mom doesn't have a master plan. She is pregnant, she conceives, and she has a baby boy in the midst of these terrible times, and she hides him for as long as she can, and then prepares a basket that will hold him and relinquishes him into the bulrushes of the Nile, with his sister looking on. As fate would have it, Pharaoh's daughter happens upon the basket and the baby, and she wants to keep the baby against the law, mind you, against the law. Pharaoh's daughter.
Against her own dad.
Names him Moses, which you may know from other Egyptian names like Ramses, Thutmose. This is a very common Moses name in ancient Egyptian names. She names him, and Moses' sister Miriam is watching on and volunteers her mother, Moses' mother, to be the wet nurse for the child. So Moses will be nursed by his mother, but will grow up in Pharaoh's house. So one of the things that is so interesting about the setup of the story at this point is we're left as readers really wondering, like, who is Moses going to be? We leave him as an infant in Pharaoh's house, and we pick up when he's older, and we learn nothing about his childhood, which, of course, if you're making the movie, this is what you have to fill in, like all the, what is it like in Pharaoh's house with Moses growing up next to the Pharaoh who will be the Pharaoh when Moses is leading the people out, right? This is the part where if you're making the movie, you can't just skip it. There's too much potential there, but the narrative just skips it all. In verse 11, one day after Moses had grown up, that's all we get for Moses' childhood. It's often the gaps in Hebrew narrative that are the most engaging for you as readers. Like, what happened? What's happening here? We have to infer. And apparently, Moses finds out somehow along the way that he is related to the Hebrew people, because in verse 11, we're told Moses grown up, 2:11. He went out to his people. And note how the language of the text emphasizes Moses's connection with the Israelites. He went out to his people, saw their forced labor, saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that. Seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. All right. Why does Moses do this? We don't know, but the fact that the text emphasizes his identification with the Hebrews suggests that he is, one, interested in defending the defenseless and rescuing the oppressed, but also that he identifies with the Israelites as his own people. Then we get another event. He went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he said, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" And the Hebrews answer in a way that indicates that they do not identify with Moses. It suggests the way that he identifies with them. Who are you? They ask. That's a big question at this point in the narrative. Who is Moses? Who made you a ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. Then we learn that Pharaoh heard of it and he sought to kill Moses. So Moses's face is in those like old-timey Western wanted posters, and it's put up on the pyramids, and Pharaoh's after Moses for murder. Again, the question, we learned something else about Moses here by his attempt to intervene. And then a third event happens, all in rapid order, right? He kills the Egyptian beating the Hebrew. He tries to intervene to keep the Hebrews from fighting one another. And then third, he flees from Egypt in verse 15. He settled in the land of Midian, sat down by a well, and the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. Again, we learned something about Moses' identity here. He is going to defend the defenseless. And when they returned to their father, he says, "How are you back so soon?" And they said, an Egyptian helped. He looks Egyptian. He smells Egyptian. He dresses Egyptian. He's been raised in Pharaoh's house, but he clearly identifies with the Hebrews. So again, the big question is, who is Moses? He's born to Levite parents, raised by Pharaoh's daughter as her son. We're told in chapter 2, verse 10. The language in verse 11 stresses his kinship ties to his people, but then a fellow Hebrew rejects his identification with them. He acts out against and gets rejected by Egypt, and then he goes to Midian. This is in Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula, and he attacks some shepherds and then becomes a shepherd himself for 40 years. He marries a Midianite woman, one of these 7 priests, daughters of the priest. Her name's Zipporah, and she refers to him as an Egyptian. In verse 19 there, I just read, to her father. And he and Zipporah have a son whom he names Gershom, which means, Ger means stranger, and Shom means there, stranger there. So he lives for 40 years in Midian. You can read all of this, I think, as preparation for Moses to answer God's call to deliver the people, which is what we get in chapter 3 in the burning bush. He's got prophetic and righteous anger. He is willing to kill the Egyptian oppressor for beating the Hebrew slave. He tries to overcome violent strife within the oppressed class, and he protects the daughters of the priest from the shepherds. He's ready to fight for justice. But he's also been a shepherd. He knows how to lead animals around, animals who are not his own. The people he will lead out of Egypt are not a people. They're referred to as a mixed group. They're not identified by their shared ancestry, but by their common experience of oppression and their common desire to depart from Egypt and organize an alternative society to Egypt. Okay, all that's set up. But back in Egypt, nothing has improved for the Israelites. Chapter 2 ends in verses 23 to 25 with, note the language. You don't have all caps like on a text in ancient Israel, right? So the way you get emphasis is you don't have underlining or italics. You get emphasis through repetition. The Israelites groaned under their slavery, cried out of their slavery. Their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. So you get these 4 different verbs describing Israel's anguish at the ruthless oppression of the Egyptians: groan, outcry, cry for help, rise up. And then 4 verbs are matched by 4 verbs that describe God's attention to ancient Israel's pain. God heard, remembered, looked, and took notice. All of God's sense perceptions are open to Israel and Israel's pain, and because of it, hell's going to break out upon Egypt. But notice, it all changes with the outcry. One of my teachers, many of you know, Walter Brueggemann, noted that this is more of a primal scream. It's not even a prayer. Often the language of prayer in the Bible is, the word outcry is used in the language of prayer. In the Psalms, often people cry out. But here, the outcry is not said to be to God. And I think this is true when we are in pain sometimes. It's not important who listens when you're in so much pain. Pharaoh could have noticed for all they care. But again, God notices, and this is the pattern in the Hebrew Bible, that people cry out and God notices. And then God tells all of this to Moses at the beginning of chapter 3 in the burning bush story. If you just skip down to verse 7 of chapter 3, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, milk and honey and all the rest. So you can imagine Moses at the burning bush, giving a slow clap to God, like, okay, it's about time. It's, according to the biblical narrative, 400 years of oppression, of all kinds of horrors, of ruthless tasks. And God says to Moses, I'm ready to deliver the people. I remember my covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And yet it's only in verse 10. I just left off at the end of verse 8. But in verse 10, the rubber meets the road, right? So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Right, so all well and good. God's going to deliver God's people. But then in verse 10, it's, so I need you to go back to Egypt. Remember how Moses left Egypt, right? His face is on the pyramids in the wanted sign. He's a murderer. And he asks, understandably, protesting, who am I? That's the question, right? That's the big question in the narrative. Who is Moses? Other big questions. Who is ancient Israel? And who is Israel? Who is this God? And he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Now you compare Moses's I to Pharaoh, right? And that's a good question. Moses looks fairly puny. He is an outlaw. He is a shepherd. And he is a foreign immigrant living and sojourning in Midian in Arabia. And who is he compared to Pharaoh to bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God responds that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you're a criminal, that you're a wanted man, that you killed an Egyptian, that you're just a shepherd. They're the mighty Egyptians. It doesn't matter. It's not about you, and it's not about who Pharaoh is. It's about me and who I am. And all you have, Moses, is a promise. Only sign that you're going to get, God ends up saying to Moses, that I'll bring you back here, which isn't very much of a sign ahead of time, right? That after the fact, I'll bring you back here. Moses replies then, okay, so who are you? Again, this is the big question of the story. Who is this God? And God gives, again, not a very clear answer. This is where we get in verse 14 of chapter 3. In translating the Nrsv, I am who I am. It's the to be verb in the first person singular with the relative pronoun, and then the to be verb in the first person singular. I am, there's no tense in Hebrew, so I will be that or who or what I shall be, or I will be who I will be. It's not much of a name. I think we can agree, right? It's I am. I will be who I will be. And thus you shall say to the Israelites in verse 14, tell them when they ask you who I am, that as Moses has said, can I get your card so that I can know who you are? Which God is this? Who's talking to me? And he says, tell the Israelites that I am sent me to you. And then God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, now a third name, the Lord is how it's translated into the Nrsv with small capital letters, which is the third person of the to be verb, probably pronounced in the ancient world Yahweh, still unpronounced by Orthodox pious Jews, who will refer to Adonai, which is how we get Lord, which is the Hebrew for Lord, or Hashem for the name. In the Nrsv, we get the Lord in small caps, telling you that there is the particular personal divine name of ancient Israel's God, the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Tell them that the Lord has sent me to you. This is my name forever and my title for all generations. Okay, so God says it's not about you. It's not about Pharaoh. It's about me. And Moses says, well, who are you? And God says, you just wait and see. I will be who I will be. I will be who I will be in the Exodus, and you're not going to believe it. And divine names in the ancient world often come with some power. If you have God's name, you can call on God's name, evoke God's presence. And so this is not the only story where we see a slight reluctance from God about giving God's name to God's people. You may think about Jacob wrestling with God at the river Jabbok, where he wants to know your name. And here God appears to say to Moses, I'll give you a bit of a name, but what my name is really just saying, wait and see. You're not going to believe the boils, and you're not going to believe the flies, and you're not going to believe the angel of death. You won't believe what I'm capable of. Wait and see. So again, we note how the questions about Moses' identity and Yahweh's identity and Israel's identity are all entangled with one another. And they are primary questions that this story of the Exodus attempts to answer. So we continue to get a bunch of hemming and hawing from Moses in chapter 4, and we get Aaron, who's said to be like a prophet for Moses, because Moses says, all shucks, I can't speak very well, and how am I? And so there's a bunch of back and forth, and a very strange story at the end of chapter 4, which we can talk about more if you'd like. And then in chapter 5, we get sort of, if you imagine the movie version, take 1 of the Exodus. And Moses and Aaron go into Egypt and go to Pharaoh and say, thus says the Lord in chapter 5, verse 1, let my people go, so they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. That's interesting, right? Because we would have thought that they don't just want to go worship God in the wilderness. We thought they wanted to leave Egypt for a new land. So we don't know what's behind this. Again, Hebrew narrative is so often fraught with background, where you have to ask, like, what does he mean? What does he intend? We're not let into the inner intentions and motivations of the characters. We have to infer that, and often we are left questioning what that may be. But Pharaoh says, who is Yahweh? Do you see that in 5:2? That's the question, right? Who's Yahweh? Pharaoh's got thousands of gods in the Egyptian pantheon, and he doesn't know who Yahweh is. Who is Yahweh that I should heed him and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go. So this story, the Exodus story that's going to unfold after this, from this moment on, is going to become very much a story of a conflict between different identities. Pharaoh, who inhabits his world with many gods, thousands of them, literally, but none of them are this no-name desert god, Yahweh. And the competition and conflict will be with this unheard of, no-name Yahweh desert god. Then what follows in chapter 5 is, and this is again from my teacher, Walter Brueggemann, who has an article, incredible, I've never noticed this before he made this argument, in which he lays out 10 commandments in chapter 5. Pharaoh gives 10 commandments, and I will just skim through them quickly, and then I'll stop speaking so we can have a conversation about things that you noticed. But get to your labors in verse 4. You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. In verse 7. In verse 9, let heavier work be laid on them. In verse 11, go and get straw yourselves, wherever you can find it. Verse 5, complete your work. It's all about getting the quota done. You've got now an increased quota. You better increase your productivity. You're now going to have to go gather straw and still produce the same amount of bricks. And I could go on listing the commandments. But another thing that Pharaoh says is you are lazy. Lazy. That's why you say you want to go worship, because you're lazy. And Pharaoh continues giving his 10 commandments. And the Israelites now have to do more work. So how do you think they feel about Moses? You know, it's not hard to imagine that they are not too pleased with this person who has come into town from Arabia and promised liberation and delivered only more work that they have to do already in such backbreaking, ruthless conditions. So Moses prays a prayer in verse 22 of chapter 5, very end, in verse 23 of chapter 5. And this is interesting. I suspect many of you are used to people praying very pious prayers where it almost sounds like you are scared of God. Oh Lord, I don't deserve anything, but, well, that's not the way Moses prays to God. If you want to pray like Moses, it is much more bold and confrontational. Oh, Yahweh, says Moses, why have you mistreated this people? Why did you ever send me? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak your name, he has mistreated this people, and you've done nothing at all to deliver your people. Amen? Amen? That's Moses. That's the way Moses prays, and that's the way many of the psalmists pray too, if you are familiar with the Psalms. Where are you? Get up. Time to get to work. You've promised much and delivered nothing. In fact, everything has only gotten worse. So we have in chapter 6, take 2 of the Moses story, where God again reveals this name to Moses and commissions Moses to go. And we get another presentation of Aaron as the spokesperson, the prophet for Moses. And then that leads in chapter 7 to the beginning of the plagues, where we now get the narrative will be underway in terms of the beginning of the deliverance. So that is kind of a close walk through these first 6 chapters. I know that was a lot, but there's so much in the text. There's so much we didn't even talk about. But hopefully that gives you a handle on the story of the Exodus as a whole. Like, what is this story? Why is it so important? Why would Brent Strawn say it is the most important story in the Bible? And then how does it begin? And there's much more in the text, but I would love to hear from you, your thoughts as you read. So if you would unmute yourselves and share with us your thoughts about this text, that would be great.
Even if you didn't mute yourself, I probably muted you so that we could hear Davis throughout all of that. And if you don't know how to unmute yourself, I think I have that power at my fingertips too, which is a little scary. But and Davis, Greg did send a question while you were talking about the name of God. Greg, do you want to ask that question, or do you want me to just read what you sent? Oh, you're muted.
Just read it.
Okay. He says the Pershita refers to God's name as Ahaya. Is there a different meaning to this name than the NRSV name I am?
No, that would be the first person, the I am, not the third person.
Davis, I have a question. Back in chapter 1, they built Pithom and Ramses. Wasn't Ramses supposedly Moses' brother in the movie? I mean,
Yes.
that made,
Yeah, exactly. So here, those are referred to as names for these supply cities, these storage cities. And yes, most people think that the whole question, which I didn't go into at all, about was there an Exodus? Did something like this actually happen? Is a huge question, because we don't find any like archaeological evidence to support the details of the story. But when it comes to thinking about if there were an Exodus, when might it have happened in history, most people do think that Ramses is probably the Pharaoh at that time, who was Pharaoh if something like an Exodus happened, when it happened. And so I don't know if there's any, I mean, obviously here, this isn't a reference to a person, but yes, you're exactly right, that this would be that Ramses' father who's building storage cities, and one of them is named Ramses. But in the narrative is not interested in telling us history, right? It doesn't name the Pharaoh. It's interested in Pharaoh as an idea of the sort of, again, paradigmatic, oppressive opponent to God and God's liberating journey for God's people.
thank you.
Yeah.
I have a practical question. When it said that he increased their labor and go after their own bricks and everything, but the harder they worked, the more they multiplied. How did that work?
Great question. Again, another question which often, like, looking into the history of interpretation pays off with issues like this, where you're like, how have people read this? How have they come to terms with it? There's, in the Midrash, at least one Midrash on Exodus, it says that it's all about the women, interestingly enough, that the men were demoralized and fatigued and defeated, and the women would go out into the fields and bring them food and give them a massage and lie with them in the fields. And that's how the women sustain this life-giving force that the men were. But the text doesn't tell us. It doesn't explain anything. But interestingly, in the history of interpretation, you find efforts at understanding why does ruthless oppression lead, in this case, to not to the extinguishing of the life force, but to its blossoming. And yeah, it's a great question.
Well, more about the women. I appreciate your bringing all this to our attention. And it is another point I wanted to make is that during that time, women nursed their babies for a long, long time, 3 or 4 years old or longer. And I just kind of feel like Miriam and her mother were being very cagey. In my mind, I can picture them knowing that the Pharaoh's daughter is there. Well, we'll show up during that time period where she's usually bathing. And how cool is this that old Miriam says, hey, do you need someone to nurse this baby? I think I got just the one for you. So I thought that was a real cagey part about the women, in addition to what the midwives did. I just, in my mind's eye, I can just see this playing out as a mother looking for a way for this child to survive. And then those formative years, she's paid to nurse her own baby. How cool is that? I mean, you got to be with him a little longer.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, evidently he was, 3 or 4 years old before he went into the palace. How did Pharaoh's daughter explain that?
Great questions.
I
Davis?
got a feeling she was whispering a lot in that baby's ear as she was nursing him. as a toddler and as long as she could.
Yep.
Davis,
Shirley, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
it reminds me again and again of what insignificant, almost unnoticed events have incredible power and ultimately make change. I'm just struck by that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I was struck rereading the text this time too about that thing
Is it over?
He's frozen. Stephanie, are you frozen too? I think there might be an internet problem at their house because Stephanie looks like she's also frozen.
We turned him to stone.
Oh dear. Yeah. That
We're
wasn't
next
one of the
door. I'll go
plagues,
get
was it? Hopefully they can reboot in a second and we can continue to ask questions. Do other folks have some questions too that we can? I can make a note about some of those and maybe let me try to see if I can also send them a chat message to see if they're out there still.
Kathy, I do.
Okay.
Who is thought to be the author of Exodus, and where was the manuscripts first found, and how's that played out?
Moses.
And a traditional understanding. Oh, yes, but we're going to need to get Davis to give you a good answer about that, about the different writers and the historical critical tradition. There's an understanding of a few different sources of these original texts, particularly even these first 5 books of scripture. And he'll be able, there's a priestly writer, a Deuteronomic writer, and I'm going to get, hopefully we'll get, they've both signed off because they must have realized they were frozen. Hopefully they'll be back on and can answer that. And your second part, Alex, was, and where did they, like the author and then?
Just the chronology of the documents themselves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how many times do we think it was reinterpreted, the language, the choice of the pronouns. You know, Moses didn't use I don't think he used the first person pronoun writing about himself. So somebody changed the pronoun somewhere.
In the text, yeah, it's right. It's told more as a story as opposed to him saying, I did this, but Moses then led the people, and yeah, that way. Yeah, we're going to need the biblical scholar because I'm a little rusty about all those things from my Old Testament classes from 25 years ago.
Hey, Kathy.
Yeah.
If I read this right, it really is a second generation Pharaoh that Moses was confronting, right? It was not the guy that actually originated the oppression.
400 years.
Say that. Are you talking about the Pharaoh?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think the story certainly, as they talk about, and how long Moses was in Midian and how many years. Yes, there's definitely successors of that king of Egypt or Pharaoh, not the same person every time.
There's a reference in there that says, it's okay for you to go back now. The people who were after you are all dead.
You're back.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Hello, Davis. We've had a couple of good questions. I had people just continue to share their questions. And Alex's question was about authorship of this book of Exodus and the sort of where were some of the oldest manuscripts found, and a sense of sort of chronology of the book. And it's, I guess, Alex, you can maybe add to that. Are you in its totality, or were there pieces that are together? Is that some of your question?
Yeah, any observations? I've been reading the NIV Study Bible, and it's got crypt notes. It's got a little summary at the first. And I don't know whether to believe what it says or not, but it makes good reading. But it isn't clear to me about why the pronouns. Moses never used the pronoun I did this and I did that. So I just was wondering where the scrolls were first discovered, and have they been reinterpreted along the way to the version we now have?
Yeah, that's a great question with a really complicated answer. So
Answer offline.
just to be brief, most people there are multiple reasons to think that there were probably multiple versions of this story that circulated for a long time. We get very early references to the Exodus that don't confirm the narrative details of the story we have here, but to some awareness of some event. Like, by the way, has anybody been to Greece? If you have you noticed? Did you notice the exit signs in Greece? There, it says Exodus over the door. It just means way out. So, and I remember when I went to Greece, I was like, Exodus. Every time I leave this building, I'm doing an Exodus. Like, just amazing. Anyway, there are early references to the event, but it's clear that the narrative as we have it in the book of Exodus is a complex merging together of multiple traditions that probably were quite early, but at the end of the day, the book is probably put together around the time of the exile, which is 600 years after it purportedly happens. So it's very difficult story to talk about history, and then the history of the book of Exodus versus did a group come out of Egypt who remembered their liberation as being attributable to this desert god Yahweh. There are multiple texts that attest there may be something back there to that memory, but the story as we have it in the book of Exodus is from much later in time and is a merging together of multiple. So for example, the two times that you get, here's my name to Moses in chapter 3 in the burning bush, and then in chapter 6 in the take 2 of Exodus, most people think that those were probably originally independent versions of the revelation of the divine name to Moses for the first time that have been put together in this literary way as a take 1, take 2 of Exodus. But there are probably different versions of that same story, independent of one another originally.
David, perhaps I've seen Charlton Heston too many times, but there's a word that I've been reading through that's missing that is in the movie a lot, and that's Nefertiti. Is there a Nefertiti?
As in the queen?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there was a Nefertiti. I'm not. Was Nefertiti Ramses' wife?
Ramses' wife, but she was in love with Moses.
Oh, yeah.
What?
Yeah, I don't know. That might be an Oedipal aspect of the story that comes more from Greek traditions than from Hebrew, but you don't get that in the text.
That might be Cecil B. DeMille.
She was Ramses' wife in the movie. She did marry Ramses in the movie.
Yeah.
It's about
In love
10:30,
with Moses.
or actually after 10:30. So we had said we would try to wrap up close to 10:30, and I feel like we're just getting started. So I hate to even say that it's 10:30. But our plan was, and I meant to say this at the beginning, and I forgot that for folks who want to stay on after like official class time, we can stay and sort of visit. That might include some more questions, or it might just be some visiting time like some of us do on Sunday morning before we head into the worship time. So I hate to cut us off, but I want to say I know you will join me in thanking Davis for that great introduction to Exodus. I realized once he got started, I thought, just like I think our sermon series of 8 or 9 weeks isn't anywhere near enough time to cover the book of Exodus, 4 Sunday morning classes are not nearly enough. But I hope we'll each keep reading, be sort of between these Sundays, and that between these classes and the sermons, we'll have a much better sense of this really central biblical narrative by the time we get to the middle of August. So thank you so much, Davis. Everyone is welcome to remain on the screen as you want to, or you're free to sign off if you prefer, and we'll visit for about 10 or 15 minutes and then have time to sign off of this platform before we enter Facebook or YouTube for worship at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much, Davis. This was a great beginning to this series. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Davis.
Thank you all for being here. So great.
Thank you.
Could I make a comment?
Sure. This is time to chat
I
or
watched
comment or whatever.
the lengthy treatise last night about George Washington's life. And I'm struck about how the parallels are with Moses. Going back to what Shirley Harris had said, the small things that happened along the way, you know, it was unbelievable that we're even here today. Miracles really that happened with those folks to get their mission done.
That's a good analogy for today, Barbara. Thank you for helping to make that connection. But I did too appreciate Shirley's comment, because I think the older that I am, the more I realize that things that seemed insignificant really, in hindsight, are not.
Well, at one point, he even said, when questioned by one of his generals, how are we going to do that? Well, we'll do so and so, and the rest is providence.
Oh, wow.
That's a great analogy.
The reference to MLK this morning just blew me away. I just, for some reason, never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I want to say the reference to all the women who had important roles in making all this happen. That is a part of the Old Testament that I was not aware of. How outstanding the women's involvement was in the Exodus.
And just a tiny footnote about Moses' mother. In actual fact, she really did not disobey Pharaoh's order. She did throw her child into the river, but in a basket.
Good point.
Good to see you, Carolyn.
Another good explanation of the subversion, Carolyn. Yeah,
exactly.
Like that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think the women piece kind of struck me as well, especially with the midwives, Pua and Shipra, where they were midwives, but yet they were the ones supposed to kill the infants. Which think about that. They bring life into the world, and they're supposed to take it out. Which that just really struck me. The other thing that was kind of interesting was when Davis was doing his intro, he had said, just as he said that, talking about John the Baptist had baptized Jesus, Alice Salthouse came on my screen. I don't know if anybody else saw that, and her t-shirt says Team Jesus, just as he said that. And so all through this, I was like, Alice's shirt is really making a statement to me. And I think we're all going to need to be Team Jesus, and in a big way over the next few months. So that was interesting.
I don't know how many of you have seen the most recent Harriet Tubman movie, which was released within the past few years, but talking about underestimating women. She apparently was very small in size.
Yes.
And was, as Davis said, known as Moses, but everyone thought that Moses was a man, because they said no way could a woman do these things. So she was able, to go under the uncaught for so long, because they underestimated her as a woman too. So I think that I didn't realize that part of her story, and I didn't realize she was called Moses until we saw that film and her bringing people into the promised land out of slavery. It's a really great movie adaptation of her life if you haven't seen it.
She's one of the ones that are going to have a statue of her in the new Hall of Fame being built in the Bronx.
Oh, wow.
Did you guys read Mitch Albom's book online that he wrote one chapter a month called Human Touch for the pandemic? He wrote one chapter per week, and the hero of the story is a little Haitian boy named Moses. It's definitely worth a read.
And it's just online, Mark?
Just online. It's called Human Touch.
It doesn't cost anything.
Yes. Just go to mitchalbum.com.
Okay, thank you. This is great. Sharing resources, a good movie, a good online read. This is
Dave,
good
Anybody
additional
watch
sharing.
Hamilton?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Who
Yes.
knew rap
It's so
existed back
good.
then?
That was, it took me a while to debrief myself and even go to sleep because I had that beat in my head.
I like that image, Karen, of you rocking out to Hamilton.
I have to share a funny story related to that from my house. So, you know, I have two teenagers and one almost teenager. And so immediately the oldest, Ryan, had downloaded Hamilton when it was available. And his sisters, who maybe haven't taken as detailed a U.S. history class as he has, one of them said to him last night, "Who is that?" And he said, his answer back was, "The goat." So I don't know if y'all know, this is like one of these teenager expressions, the greatest of all times. And I just loved how my 17-year-old said Alexander Hamilton was the greatest of all times. And he was telling his sisters about how much of, you know, the Constitution and the Federalist Papers that this one guy had written and how smart he was and what kind of a person he was. But anyway, I just loved how my 17-year-old referred to Alexander Hamilton as the goat.
Yeah, you know, we've
I
been
had to
speaking
pass
about
that on.
speaking about women in history. His wife also, you know, she lived to be 97 or 98. She's the one that raised the money for the Washington Monument. She started the first what was it? Private orphanage. I mean, pretty incredible.
Davis, I'm curious about Moses' status because he lived in Pharaoh's house, so he's one of the elite. And the elite generally killed slaves and mere mortal citizens at their leisure, but yet he was freaked out about killing the slave. What was his status?
I mean, yeah, I think that's really like the drama underlying the whole narrative is he's an Israelite, but he's not an Israelite. He's an Egyptian, but he's not an Egyptian. He's a shepherd, but of someone else's sheep. And I think I think that question about what is Moses' status is the question underlying much of the drama.
Does anybody have any? Oh, go ahead, Davis. Sorry.
I was just saying, I know that's not an answer. It's just affirming that's
a cop out, David. That's a cop out.
You'd be a politician.
Absolutely.
David, speaking of your traffic signs in Greece, you know, in Italy, they're in musical terms, like retard, slow down.
Well, I was wondering, and I was going to look to Stephanie or any others, if anybody has any just general announcements about things that might be happening in the life of the church this week or anything else. Or, I mean, maybe anybody has a joy or a concern to share that you'd like to share with this crowd gathered on Zoom. It's so nice to see so many faces, I have to say. I know many of us, as this continues on, have expressed how we're kind of tired of Zoom. I mean, I have said that to some people too, even though it's become critically important for ministry at Rumpel. But it sure is nice to see so many faces up here together today. So
I have a save the date for all of you. Those of you, and even for anyone could come to this, but especially those of you who have been doing our 21-day challenge, our racism challenge, we are going to have the Reverend Jimmy Hawkins speak to our collective small groups on Thursday, July 16th at 9 a.m. He is a North Carolinian. He is the head of the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Presbyterian Church USA. If you don't know, we have an office right near, it's across the street from the Supreme Court, where we do advocacy work in accordance to what the larger PCUSA deems important in terms of policy for the U.S. government. So that office meets with representatives and does a lot of important work, and also gets the word out to people in congregations like us on how we might do some advocacy and policy work as well. So he is going to speak to our group, to our small groups, but really anyone is welcome about their work, and also about how many of us have been thinking in terms, what could we do? Are there things we could do? And so this may give us some ideas for things that we can do as well. But he's also very funny and just really a great guy to know. So you will really enjoy meeting him. He very graciously met with my group of college students. We went to Washington, D.C. last fall, which seems impossible to think that we actually went on a trip somewhere in October. But I've taken a group there twice, and it's been really impactful to hear about the work that our church is doing in Washington, D.C.
And Stephanie said he's a North Carolinian. Jimmy was a pastor in Greensboro for a long time before he went to do this work. So he knows our part of the world well too, which I think is a nice connection.
Say the time again.
It's January, July 16th at 9 a.m. Two of the small groups are meeting at 9 a.m. So I gave him a couple of different options, and that was the one that he chose. So I hope that'll work with people's schedules, and we'll try and keep it to an hour because I know many people are still working.
And we'll send it out in the different emails and other things, which is, I guess, maybe a segue to a not so exciting announcement. Well, two things. One, if you didn't already know this, next Sunday morning, Davis is not teaching one of these classes, but he's the preacher. So we're going to get to hear a Davis sermon on the Exodus story of the manna and quail in the wilderness. So that will, it's a great text. Davis was happy to receive that as his text in the sermon series. I was sad that I wasn't getting to preach on it because it's such a good story, but we'll have a fantastic sermon next Sunday from Davis. So you'll get to hear him again next Sunday. And then Cameron will be teaching in the class in the beginning. And the segue I was trying to make previously was just, Jessica, and I think some of us on the staff are aware that many folks may not be getting all of our church emails very easily. And what appears to be happening is if you have a Gmail account, a lot of the church emails are going into the promotions folder instead of your inbox. So you may want to check that folder and then change the settings in your Gmail so that anything that comes from Rumpel Memorial Presbyterian goes into your inbox. There is also a way to go back to an earlier Gmail format that doesn't sort your emails for you into those three folders. We're going to try to send out some instructions. The problem with that is if you aren't getting the emails and we send you an email with instructions, it's probably not going to be the most helpful. And if you know folks who are still afraid of this Zoom platform, Rachel, who's still on there, our intern, and Eric, our accompanist, these are our staff members who are millennials. They have put together a really good tutorial about Zoom, and they, along with Brianna Meadows, one of our college students, have said they'll be happy to help anybody who's still afraid of Zoom. So if you have church friends who said, I can't do Zoom or whatever, please tell them to get in touch with Jessica, and we'll see if some of these young people can slowly and graciously talk them through it. Since it does seem to me, particularly with cases on the rise in North Carolina, and in the place that I research information now has Watauga County as a hot spot in North Carolina. We may be doing this for a while still. So certainly my hope as Rumpel's pastor is that more folks will be able to get connected this way, because it may be the way we connect for a while.
Kathy, we'd like to thank you for the recommendation of Red Shirts, the blog. It was powerful, tough read, but I think important.
Great. Well, we may try to, when this, that's a reference to an additional resource in this 21-day Confronting Racism study. We may try to make some of those resources, additional resources available as we go ahead to Stephanie and Rachel and Camille and I probably need to put our heads together about all of that. Well, it's almost 10 till 11, and maybe we're all experienced with how we switch from Zoom to then log on to YouTube or Facebook, but I want to make sure we have time to transition. And thank Davis again for a great start to this series. Thanks to all of you for joining from wherever you are. And I hope I'll see you in some virtual chat in worship in about 10 minutes.
We used our new camera today, so
Yes.
let us know what you think.
Yes, please. We are still learning some of its technical issues. It recorded all of the worship in 5-minute segments, which we didn't know. So, but give us your feedback. The sound is supposed to be a whole bunch better, and hopefully the visuals are also better too. So this is an exciting new day of worship for us. So thanks for mentioning that, Stephanie. I forgot.
Yep.
Be well, everyone. Bye.
Good job.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.